So here I'm going to tell you about the static members of the class, their scope and their lifetime. Have a look at this. Suppose this is your private section of the class. Suppose a class with its private section. Let us take 3 classes with 3 different private sections. And then you have a public section of the class in which you will be keeping some functions or data, whatever. And then you have declared a variable called static variable in the private section of the class. And then you declare 3 objects of the class. Suppose these are objects of the class. 1 object, 2 object, and 3 objects of 3 different classes. So this is the private section. Now this is 1 object. Let us give it a color blue. This private section will belong to this class. Another object. This private section will belong to this object. Another object. And this private section will belong to this object. You are familiar with this access mechanism. Now have a look at this. This object, let me put this here. This is a private section. And this is the object of this class. Object. Now this is your static member, static variable, declared in the private section of the class. Okay. How will the static variable be accessible? What will its scope and lifetime? Well, this is the object which uses the public section and its own object and will use the static data as well. This is your object. Okay. Now let's have a look at the other object. This object will be able to access these many things. We'll be able to access public section, okay, fine, which is common, will be accessible by the blue object or the green object. The blue object will have its own private data, but the green object will have its own private data, fine. But look at the static variable, despite being in the private section, it is being shared between both the objects. Same goes with this function. Will have its own private section, but then share the static portion. This is the scope rule. Every object will have its own private section, but the static variable is shared among all. Watch this. Both data members and functions could be static members of the class, can be declared as static. Static variable I told you just now. We can define a class member as static using static keyword. Only one copy of the static member is created for any number of objects, and all the objects will share that one single static entity. The static member is shared by all objects of the class. All static data is initialized to 0 by default automatically. We never carry any garbage. There is no other initialization if no other initialization is present. We can put reinitialization of the static member in the class, but the changes or the reinitialization will be visible, accessible, and the new value will be updated for all the objects. It can be initialized outside of the class also using the scope resolution operator directly. Okay, static members could be declared inside the class, but the definition is always outside of the class. Okay, so you have to declare it and define it separately like this. I'll show you through an example here. Static members. So I have a static member in the public section. We'll keep it in the private section also, called object count. So even if you keep variables in the public section, these variables are always replicated for each and every object. But here you will have only one copy of this. We go to main. In the main, the object count variable, which will never belong to any object. But all the functions that you are invoking here, ba.volume, bb. So functions are invoked through object, isn't it? Because the functions belong to object. But the static variable doesn't belong to any object. So therefore static the variables are never accessed through object. Instead, the static variable belongs to class and it is accessible using scope resolution operator. So here I have declared as static defined, and here I have declared is an integer belonging to box, name is object count, static variable, assigned to value 0. Even if I wouldn't have assigned to value 0, still it would have carried 0. Then I declare object. So a 0 argument constructor do we have? Yes, we have a 0 or 3 argument constructor and a common constructor. So it will work. What does this constructor do? Let's have a look at the constructor. This is the constructor which will take if in case the values are supplied. No, the values are not supplied. So it will take default values. That is, default values are 3, 3, 3 for length, width and height. Will go 3, 3, 3 to the formal arguments and will be assigned to private members. Length, breadth and height will be assigned to the default values. And then you will say that the constructor is invoked, and then you are incrementing the static member object count, which is counting the number of objects created in your class. So object count, which was 0 initially, has now become 1 because of the invocation of this constructor. Then you invoke constructor again with one argument, first argument. So this time the first argument is 8.5, but the second and the third argument will be default 3.3 and will be initialized to private members, and again you will increment the object count to 2. This time again you invoke it for the second time and third time and the fourth time, and it will execute every time and invoke, and it will increment the object count static member. Then inside there is a function called getCount. which will print, we return object count, the value of object count. The returned value of object count will be printed here. Okay. It will prove to you that the object count didn't belong to any object, and it was accessible by all the objects through the constructors of all the objects, even through the functions also. Okay, and carries the values across objects, across functions. Let's try this. G++, compile all the C++ files. No, compile only. Now link, give name demo from all the object files. Run demo. Look at the object count, total objects 4. So this proves to us that the static member that we have created here was only one copy that was being incremented every time we were creating new object, and different constructors belonging to different objects were incrementing the same common static variable. Isn't it? Notice, I have kept this static integer variable declared inside class. This is not the complete definition, just like extern. You have to declare it exclusively in the global space. You may or may not give it value 0. Okay.
Where do static variables that is?
Can you repeat? The volume is very low. Can you be a little louder?
Sir, I'm saying, where are the static variables declared? In the stack segment or in the data segment?
Well, they're declared. If the object you have created here are in the private section, declared locally, then everything belonging to the private or the public section, that is the data, will get stored in the stack segment. But because the object count doesn't belong to any object, so it will never go into the stack frame of any object. So therefore, it will be allocated and stored in the initialized section of the data segment. Right? Anything else? Any more questions you have? Very nice. So, yes, please go ahead.
Sir, declaring static variable here in either in public or private sector section, does that means it does not affect it?
Well, as far as storage is concerned, it will be stored in the initialized section of the data segment. But as far as access mechanism is concerned, if the static variable is invoked here, kept in the public section, then it will be accessed directly through the object, as we have done, directly by resolving the scope of the class. Okay, but if the static members are kept in the private section of the class, the rule says that the private section could be accessed only through the public section. Listen this carefully, very good question. If the private static members is kept in the private section, then the private section could only be accessed through the member functions, public member functions, and the public members functions could be accessed through the object. Now there is a contradiction. Using object, you are calling the function that belongs to object, and now from the function that belongs to object, you are trying to access a static member in the private section that doesn't belong to any object. You see contradiction here? Therefore, the rule is that if your function is accessing a static member, then that function will also should be a static function. Like this. This is the rule. Now that is your assignment. To take your static variable to the private section and try to access it. Remember, the function that will access the static variable in the private must also be static and will not belong to any function once again, and will not belong to any object. Because the function will become static, that function will also not belong to any object, so you will not call it like object dot static function. No, it will be class scope resolution static function which will access static variables. It will be like this. You will try this as your assignment and let me know if you are able to do it or not.
Okay.
I have another example showing that, but because of my out of time, so I'm giving it to you as assignment. If you're able to do it, fine. Otherwise, I'll show you in the next class. So that's all I got for you today. Thank you very much.